got an Agile panel here. We've got some absolutely fantastic people on the panel, so I hope you've brought really tough, gnarly questions for them to answer on your behalf. You know, give you guys the wisdom of their years. I mean, their combined years, it's got to be going on bloody 250. You guys are getting on in age. But anyway, you know, we're talking about Agile in the large, and so you've seen Dave Thomas talk earlier today about some high level, you know, how you do Agile transformations in very large organizations, and some other tips there. Randall Ward, here in the black shirt from AppFire, they're one of our Atlassian experts. Randall and his team at AppFire get the opportunity to visit many of our largest customers and assist them with their Agile transformations. And they get to visit them on an ongoing basis. So he's got a lot of different customer stories perhaps that he can share with us. Jean-Michel is the Atlassian VP of Engineering. Jean-Michel actually comes from a background at Eclipse and then on to IBM in the Rational division. So he's got tons of years of experience there. David Jellison, you saw speak earlier. David's done or in the process of and just completing a Kanban implementation for his enterprise. They've got 1,000 people at Constant Contact. And finally on the end here, we've got Jürgen Spangl, and Jürgen is the design manager here at Atlassian. And Jürgen, we're bringing Jürgen along because these days we're hearing more and more about user experience, even in the enterprise. And so I think it's perhaps necessary for enterprise applications, and perhaps you're seeing it yourselves. So with that in mind, I'd like to open it up to the audience. I've got a mic. My colleague Dave back here, he has a mic. So when you'd like to ask a question, please just raise your hand and we'll run down and direct it to a particular participant on the panel. Who'd like to start? Thank you, sir.
Yeah, do you have experience with Agile in the embedded environment, particularly large embedded systems with rather maybe 2 deliveries a year to the customer?
Telcos, process control, oscilloscopes, instrumentation. So the answer is yes. Is there something else you want to know?
Yeah, so how did you make that work given the fact it doesn't have a regular delivery schedule, at least externally? And you know, you have lots of dependencies and getting the stories and the prioritization right.
So I don't know whether you were at my earlier talk, which went far too quickly, but we have a process that basically splits up into 4 activities: envisioning, which basically figures out what you're going to build; definition, which basically does multi-point estimates and allocates things to feature and component teams. And we do both hardware and software with the same process. So, because you have to do hardware, software co-design typically. And then we basically have traditional Agile for the actual development build process, and then a release engineering or DevOps process at the back end. You know, we have an estimation process that's more like adults do, as opposed to, you know, the happy. You know, it's good that people learn how to do story points, but in the end, we're spending, you know, maybe hundreds of millions of dollars, so we have to convert everything to dollars and so on. So we have a process for doing that. We've been building embedded systems this way since the late 80s.
Some follow-on to that. I just have a follow-on to that. So there's 2 embedded customers here that we work with, and I can happily introduce you to them afterwards. And they're using Agile, implemented the process about 18 months ago, and they're doing pretty amazing things with embedded systems. So if you can come find me, I'll hook you up with them. Great.
Hi. I have a kind of more general maybe question. Our company just started with Agile processes. We bought Greenhopper. Actually, we have Jira, we have Bonfire, we have a lot of Confluence, all these plugins. So the question is the following. So we, in the Greenhopper, we create stories. Then the sprint will be considered as completed as we have acceptance tests. So, but to me, it's not enough. Acceptance test is just repeating, making sure that the stories work. But if during the stories development, some other bugs will be introduced, and they're not directly related to the stories. So the stories will pass, but a lot of other aspects are not covered, like performance tests, some upgrades tests, so other kind of tests. How is it supported? First of all, what is the process? What is the methodology do you kind of recommend? And how is it supported within the Atlassian tools?
Maybe I'll say something a bit controversial, but I find that iteration lines cause a lot of bad behavior. People see these iteration lines, iteration 1 and 2, and they try and squeeze everything in, and if it doesn't fit over that line, I've got to do something else with it. So there's definitely a trend now of doing more feature-based development, which helps to solve that, which is I've got to get some value out, and there's some performance testing, criteria, usability testing that has to be done to make that feature awesome, and you just do the right things to make that feature actually work, as opposed to get hung up with these boundaries. And so that's a bit more like feature-based development, which is iteratively you say you've got a story or an epic, and when that epic's ready, you're going to do the right things to make that happen, whether it's a bit more upfront design or estimation, or maybe it's a bit more soak time, and that you just don't get hung up with those iteration boundaries. So I don't know.
A quick comment, if you don't use, you have to write a story for every performance requirement. Basically, non-functional requirements are BS, right? If you don't have a story for it, developer can't test it, so it won't happen. So, if you don't have stories for the performance for a given feature, don't expect it to be performance. Same for the usability or fault tolerance or whatever it is. You have to qualify what that means so that done means I ran all the stories, including those.
So,
Can you repeat the question, David? Can you repeat the follow-up question?
Yeah, I'm going to attempt to restate the question. So, the way I understand it is that we have traceability for stories and covering acceptance criteria. Sorry, I'll start over. The question, the way I understand it is that for stories, you have acceptance criteria and tests to validate that the acceptance criteria passes. But that's only part of the answer, right? That you really need to cover a full gamut of testing across the application stack and the organization. And how do you manage that, right? And more specifically, how do you manage that with Atlassian tools, I believe you asked? So as a director of quality at Constant Contact, we have to deal with this question, of course, holistically. So we have not only the story work, but we have layers of promotion because we are a SaaS application, layers of expectations up through the promotion of our test environments out to production for regression testing. So we have testing in the sandbox, which is really covering all the features completely, in addition to whatever the stories are, right? So that we have quality engineers embedded in the teams. Traditional test techniques still apply, right? We're not throwing them out. We're just organizing a little bit differently. But as you complete a feature, you're completing the acceptance criteria, but you're also creating regression tests. You're making sure that you've got enough coverage on the functionality, both positive and negative, how that works as an integration with other dependencies in other parts of the system. Performance tests are, in an Agile world, you really want to test early and often with performance testing, and then test, in a full environment and test that heavily. So I agree with adding stories where you need to, but in many cases, it should be part of the cultural practices within the team to have complete coverage for the features that you're writing, that you're creating, and that's part of the activities that the quality engineering team provides within the team.
Next question.
Okay, after we understand and our functional requirements, and we have major building blocks on the software design side, we struggle in getting the requirements for those because part of that is based on how well we can do. In other words, there's kind of what we want and what we need. And I'm just wondering if you can talk about how you work through that ambiguity, because it's not the functional guys who understand the business requirements, but it's more of the back-end architectural component side of it. So it's not the simple feature that does X, Y, Z that everybody understands. It's the back-end reliability, performance. Yeah, I'd like that search to happen in a half a second, but I'll take a second. So the requirement's not a hard one, and you need we need the software guys, the designers, to be able to give us an idea of what a reasonable requirement is. How do you merge those two together, deal with that? And where in the process?
Yeah, sure. I'll take a stab at that. So is the question more along the lines of not working close enough with that team, in alignment with that team to gather the requirements? Or is it that you feel like you're held up in your iteration waiting for those requirements to be gathered? Is it more of a timing, or is it more of a interaction with the team?
I think it's an interaction with the team, because you got these designers who want the requirements first, and they have to give key input into making those requirements.
Yeah, I think if they're the business owner, if they're the owner of that requirement, or the designers are actually contributing towards that requirement, bringing them closer to the actual owner who's issued the requirement, along with those engineers behind the scenes that are actually going to be issuing the design, that's gonna work out best for you. And iterate, right? So you've got to have those frequent sessions working with them to gather the requirements. I think what happens more frequently and more often than not, what we see in the enterprise is there's a middleman that's getting in the way, and so if you can remove the broker and actually put the two people together in the room, you'll hash out the requirements faster.
One of the classic problems is that, for instance, the people who do the database work basically don't get talked to until the Agile team tells them make the changes. So, and one of the things we've had to do with both UI and database teams is yank those people out and spread them around, because you need to have somebody who understands. Most computer scientists or end users do not understand SQL, period, end. And so if you end up having to do SQL in your back end and it has to be performant, you need to know that really early. If this thing's got to do some sort of in or outer join, so you need someone in the requirements team. That's why we do envisioning. We basically try and build the whole thing quickly, have it blow up, and say, here's the characteristics, and you have a crack database guy in there saying, look, if you're going to do this, we're going to have to schema restructure. We're going to maybe have to switch, use an in-memory database or something like that, because we can't get this performance out of our Oracle stack or whatever it is. So you need to have those people involved early, participating in the requirements, too often downstream. The other issue is sometimes the requirement is articulated and understood by someone like an architect or someone who's experienced in the product, but not by a technical specialist. And so that's why you like to have a playing coach who can sort of say, look, here's what the business said. They need this to be responsive. Here's what responsive means, so they can actually translate for them. That's why you want experienced people walking around and talking to people.
Can we get Jürgen in on that? Yeah. I was interested to hear Jürgen's take, because you mentioned user experience. And
so one way to address this is, what we try to do is visualize requirements early on, and the requirements process is actually more than just writing it down. It's actually a conversation, and it involves the back-end engineers, the business owner, and we communicate early on, like, hey, what do you mean? We sketch it quickly, and this also factors in how fast could we do this stuff, because I would design differently for something which would give a response in 2 seconds versus 2 milliseconds, and I can address this with the visual design and actually work around certain things. So it's not a hard requirement. This has to answer in 2 milliseconds. Ideally it would, but very often it's not possible. And so it's key to get them constantly involved. And one of the things what we have is the business owner has to be present. Like, I've worked in Agile environments where the business owner is only available at the beginning of the sprint and then only shows up at the very end. And this is usually not working.
Just to add to this, so I see that there are two opportunities to really fit out some of these requirements. Early on, the team needs to be having design reviews and thinking through some of these things, and inviting an architect to those discussions where possible. We also do something in Constant Contact called an OPG, an Operational Program Group session where when we're changing anything that's going into a system, we have a larger group that assembles before we introduce that to the system. We talk through the architecture, we talk through performance requirements, we talk through any of those things that are beyond what it was originally set up as acceptance criteria for that particular feature or that work. And that's been working out well for us.
So we have a question at the back of the room here. And then
Hi. In Kanban, without the Scrum boundaries, I'm wondering what's the cadence of the analysis and design for you guys? You know, when do you do this story point sizing? When do you do detailed analysis and sizing?
What do you mean by cadence in terms of how much time you spend on it, or?
Well, in Scrum, you know, you might do sprint planning every iteration. You're going to do high-level sizing. You're going to spend some time doing detailed analysis. Without those Scrum boundaries, in the Kanban process, constant flow, I'm wondering when do you have the time, or when do you take the time to take news stories, do that analysis and design, put story points on them, that kind of thing. Do you do that all up front?
He's got a one-liner.
There's a very old rule called the 80-hour rule. Seems to almost be 2 weeks. And if you let someone give something for people and just let them go off for more than 80 hours, you get what you paid for. So, I think I guess I'm an advocate for Scrumban, but I mean, basically, if you let people go open loop for too long, you're really in trouble. So it helps to have a clock. Maybe you don't need an alarm bell ringing, but it's useful to have some kind of pulse on the team. And 2 weeks is what it should be.
Yes, we are currently set up to do waterfall, and obviously our JIRA, the way we have JIRA set up, would only support the waterfall, but we're looking to move to the Agile methodology. I was wondering if any of you had some words to the wise of how to actually get started to make sure that we don't do too many faux pas while we're getting this set up. I got from the last session that I need to make sure we have fisheye and that we need to have bonfire. But any words of wisdom, or definitely do this, or for the love of God, don't ever do that, would be appreciated.
Do something without the tools first. Do it by hand so you experience it. It's very important. There's a lot of cognitive things that go on when you put cards on the wall and do it. So do something small. Make sure you actually understand the process before you worry about tooling.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Manual process first, really learn the behaviors, learn the techniques, get the cadence down with the team, bring them together. So that's definitely a great first step. The other thing is the education throughout the organization. Set a goal. What is the goal of moving to this process? Where do we want to be in 3, 6, 9 months? Write those things down together and then revisit those after a time period.
Yeah, and remember your goal is to really build something. Like your team's building something, it's not the process. So like your goal is to get better at building something. So maybe your success criteria is, are you measuring the actual output that you're doing? And then build the things into the way your team works to actually make sure you're building something better. So a year from now, don't look back and say we have an awesome process, but we're still building shitty stuff. So
I have a few thoughts on that. One is that I agree with doing it before the tool, getting it down pat. When we went to Kanban, we used whiteboards with painter's tape and sticky notes to get the process down first before we went to a tool. Made a huge difference because what we end up with the tool is different than what we started with. I think as far as getting started, understanding what doneness is, define doneness for you so that each iteration you're actually completing work that's deliverable either internally or externally. That's the magic of Agile. If you can do that, then everything else will follow. And another thing about getting started, we found that two points of engagement is important to be successful. One is that having a pilot team, a team that can really demonstrate that it's working, is powerful. Also, getting senior management to training, getting them to buy into what Agile really is, because the Agile organization needs to perform as a whole functional team. It can't be just development or just engineering releasing products. It's an organizational thing.
we went through a similar thing in a previous company. It was large telco, where we changed from waterfall to agile. And one approach we applied was actually rolling it out in an agile fashion. We put a small team together, and they started working agile just by rolling the process out. So we built up the habits. And one key thing for us was it was about agile with a lower A instead of an upper A. It was not so much about the process, but getting the agile mindset going and all of this stuff. That was key to roll it out.
And something that worked well for us too in rolling this out was pick a couple of few rules, that really matter the most. Like, you're going to read these books and there's going to be, like, you'll just be overwhelmed with things you want to do. Maybe just pick 3 things that matter the most. And I know, this was like 10 years ago on the Eclipse team, and we picked 2 things, which is we're going to ship something every iteration, and we're never going to miss our release date. Like, that was all that guided what we're doing, and that was it. And then every year we added things. Okay, we're gonna think about maybe delivering things. We're going to do retrospectives. Like, retrospective we did after the fact, So we had a couple of few rules, and then we added them as we went.
Sorry, can I just ask a question there? If you weren't doing the retrospectives and you weren't shipping and releasing at the end of the iteration, how did you address that in that first year?
Well, the goal was to, the goal of our process is we said, enterprise software teams sucked. Like, go back 10 years ago, when you're shipping enterprise software, it was a release cycle of 2 years, 2.5 years. It was unpredictable. So the first goal says, okay, the thing we wanted to solve, and this is, again, the value we wanted to become predictable, and we wanted to do that more iteratively. So we didn't think about retrospectives or process. We just really thought that's what we think is going to give us the best value, and then we added to it over the years.
Actually, all those things came from benevolent dictatorship because they came from me. I own the business that became Eclipse. So I just told people that's the way it's supposed to work. And IBM invented a process later.
Yeah, I think gradually easing into each of the ceremonies is a really good practice for the enterprise. And again, depending upon the size of your organization, the disparate nature of the group, but we always see value in easing into the ceremony. So I'll even walk into a team and we won't even call it Agile, and we'll just bring teams together in the morning and we'll have them talk about what they're going to accomplish each day, and there's a ceremony. And we get that practice going, we get that behavior instilled, and the team's coming together, and gradually over time we introduce another ceremony. And again, that's not for everyone, but that's a practice that we've seen success with.
Hi, I'd like to hear your thought and experience on using the Agile methodology on software development, but with just a tight budget. Like, how do you manage your user stories, your sprint, your backlog? Like, if you have a fixed budget, how do you manage that, and how do you approach that?
I'll let one of you guys take that. Budget. Usually I don't let that conflict with my methodology, but I'll let one of you guys.
I remember someone telling me that when there's a fixed budget, the best thing you can do with Agile is you can tell them, I'm going to save you money. Because what are you going to do? You're going to ship it more often. So I'm going to ship it every week, and you can decide when to stop paying me, when you get enough value out of it. So you're like, you know what? I can actually, fixed budget doesn't mean anything. I'm going to give you something, and you tell me when to stop. And it's your job to figure out how to give something more iteratively. And then, in theory, they should be able to say, I've got my money worth. Thanks a lot. So you should be thinking about this in a different way.
I'll go ahead here. I think there's people maybe in front of me, but I'm working in a group right now. Our team, the product owner for the project I'm on is very hands-off, very difficult to reach. He doesn't show up to our planning meetings. He often doesn't come to the demos at the ends of the sprints. He'll just pop in occasionally and say, oh, I need this, I need that. And as a Scrum Master, I have to juggle all that. I basically get to be the project owner as well. So how do I address that? What strategies can I use to try and get that product owner more involved?
I have a few suggestions on that. That's a very frequent and common experience. It hits home for me in the enterprise. That was my product owner for years, and I was a Scrum Master. And the way I addressed it was I made no barrier for them, no excuses. I provided them with no room, no wiggle room on excuses on visiting the team or working or interacting with the team. And the way I did that was we recorded videos in our retrospectives. We recorded daily delivery notes. We sent and shipped manifests on a regular basis to that person and really got our evidence in front of them to involve them more. And what happened through that channel of that product owner seeing us reaching out and them being on the road and actually distributing technology to them, they became more involved in future iterations. They started to attend more and become more aware of our process. But it's common. You're going to see it. And good for you stepping up and becoming a little bit more of a proactive product owner.
In our envisioning activity, we basically have a team that serves the role as a product owner. And in integrated product teams for years, there's always been kind of a technical-facing product owner and a marketing-facing product owner. One of the problems is a lot of people don't realize that Agile just burns out classic product owners, particularly when you don't have people that understand the domain. And so you need to put a structure in place. And so when you're putting Agile into an organization, you need to know how much time am I going to get for this. The other issue is if you're designing a complicated product, envisioning basically puts a design team there, and the design team actually produces the surrogate design, and that design has enough in it that it can answer a lot of the basic questions. If you just throw the thing into an Agile development process, then you have all sorts of problems with really lumpy backlogs. The product-oriented organizations do design first, get most of the things wrong in that design, and then they give it to engineering to build. Trying to do that without a design team, I think, is very, very difficult to do successfully.
And just one more add-on to that. I agree with that completely, except back to the gentleman on the embedded side. With long durations of product shipment dates, that can become dangerous because your market may have disappeared, right? So you may be designing things towards a market that's changed completely. If we're designing a product that's going to ship in 18 months, you've got to get that market-facing sort of product owner into your camp on a regular basis so you don't miss the market. Right?
So we prototype in a VME card cage. So we're actually, in the design process, we're actually building stuff in the hardware environment. In the current product or the next generation, with the next generation, the next set of chips or whatever it is. So that's how we try and get around that.
We had solved a similar problem with the product owner engagement by having them embedded in the teams so that they actually are a team member. It took getting to that point where we had full engagement. I think accountability for user experience, accountability for the business performance in the field, those kinds of things need to be part of what the product owner is concerned with, as well as representing the customer. And that made a big difference for us.
So I have a question about design, interaction design. I guess it's targeted at Jürgen, but I'd appreciate your thoughts. So we've been rapidly growing our design team, meaning sort of interaction, visual, user research. So the question to you is, do you kind of embed them in the Scrum teams? They have subtasks, they contribute to sort of burn down, or is it something that's sort of more of a lead indicator? They're an iteration ahead, what have you, and there's something more of an input into a particular sprint.
So depending on how big the design team is, ideally, of course, would be you have one designer or multiple designer embedded in the teams. I've worked in environments where they worked one iteration ahead. Other teams on the same product worked in the same iteration. It depends on the maturity of the project team, how good they work together, and some of them actually change throughout the product development process. They figured out, well, it's better we work one iteration ahead, and then we ran two backlogs, one for the designers, and then they handed it over to the developers, and they did the estimates on this one. The other one, I would call more mature team, they had one backlog, and the designers catch something quickly, the developers built, and in parallel, they did the visual design, and applied it on it, and actually then shipped it together. There is no hard rule. It depends on the members in the team. Yeah.
Which one worked better?
Ideally, you have them in the same iteration because you get some stuff like one of the key principles is to constantly build and fake as little as possible. Like if you one iteration ahead or sometimes even two iterations ahead, we say like fake it if you can't make it, and then we get results on the, let's say on the prototypes from the usability test. Yeah. So which one is better? Again, depends how complex the product is, depends how much legacy code you have in there. Because even if you want to ship something every iteration, sometimes it's not possible.
just don't let the design people stay in an ivory tower, right? They're worse than the database people or the DevOps guys. They, you know, if you have a design group, blow it up. You know, move them into the teams.
That's why we separated these two, right? So, and caps.
If I was just to add one more thing, and then I'll let you go for it. Just with what we've experienced is we've done both our quality engineering organization and our user experience organizations. We tend to have folks embedded in teams, and we have a center of excellence for each of those areas, so that some of the bigger designs, the more advanced things are in the center of excellence, and the sprint-based engagement is embedded and continuous.
What's that?
Yes, sir. Go.
Okay. One of the questions that I have is around basically the team. So we're at the point now where we've been doing Agile for over a year, but we still seem to have this barrier between our QA and our developers. I mean, we want to get them closer together, working closer together, and kind of break down the barrier. Well, we can't go off and test this till everything's done, which means you can't test an individual story. They want to wait till the whole feature's done. Some ideas that you may have on how to break down that barrier.
So we definitely had that problem. And a few things that we did to solve that. One is that we really pushed heavily that all stories and all tasks are testable. So we're testing in the smallest, we're developing the smallest testable chunks so that everything is testable along the way. Another thing is having each team with capable sandboxes so that they can deploy to sandboxes regularly, and quality engineers can iterate in those sandboxes before promoting anything to any other environment. And thirdly is we increase the capability of our quality engineers in the team so that they're technically capable of automating. All of our quality engineers automate, and they, as often as possible, they're collaborating with developers on a regular basis. And those tests, the regression tests and any acceptance tests, are being written on a regular basis along with the code delivery.
So I think we follow the same pattern. The first thing is they actually sit side by side. So the QA team is not in another building, another floor. So the Jira QA team is with the Jira team. When they actually start a sprint or a feature, they sit down together. And again, I think we've increased the skill set of the QA engineers we're hiring. So we expect them to be able to automate things. And we actually expect them to be able to educate the developers. So they're actually specialists at certain things. So they know how to security test. They know what kind of things you usually fuck up with. So they sit down at the beginning of the iteration and go, okay, you're going to be building a new UI for Jira. Here's the things you're going to have to think about at the beginning. And then then we deploy regularly to a sandbox. And the QA engineers are always encouraged to go test the things as it's being built. So, I mean, for that, I think it's really helped. And there's also acceptance tests at the end, but just bring them as part of the whole life cycle has really helped.
Agree. Keep them a part of the design. Sit them next to the teams. Those are all best practices for sure.
Don't hire testers, just hire developers and have them change roles.
Wow.
Okay. Oh, we are about 2 years in. Oh, can I go? Okay, we're about 2 years into our Scrum implementation, and our ongoing challenge has been more cross-team coordination. We have several Scrum teams implemented, and so our ongoing challenge is more cross-team coordination and then having visibility into deliverables more so at an epic level so that we can kind of understand how the teams are progressing from a strategic level. We have strategic initiatives that we're trying to keep track of at a much higher level than what the teams individually work at. So, historically, I've tried to implement a Scrum of Scrums, and the Scrum of Scrums is without having a room full of people meeting to discuss different parts of deliverables. I just haven't had very much success implementing a Scrum of Scrums historically. And it looks like we may revisit that or look at other options. So just wondering what kind of recommendations you have for for me.
Yeah. What are you using for tools? Are you using any tooling, electronic tooling, or
You mean-
any visual boards, any sort of placement
Well,
for the?
one thing that I've done is implemented the structure plugin by Igor to try to tie stories into a higher level and then try to track them that way. But as far as tools outside of the Jira Greenhopper realm, and maybe some supplementation from project, those are the tools that we have for visibility.
Scrum has nothing to say about what happens above teams. There is a book that was written in a hurry to have the answer, but Scrum of Scrums is nonsense for any large organization. The answer is you have to have some kind of architecture and some set of interfaces, and you have to have a dependency map, which you should do at the beginning, not use Structure 101 to get all the wrong dependencies afterwards. Right? That's another example of a tool in the wrong place. So you really need to look at how software engineering organizations work, because Scrum isn't going to solve that problem.
And guys, we've only got time for one more question. So
Can I just do one quick response
Oh,
there? So
apologies, David.
we actually did away with Scrum of Scrums. It became ineffective. I think it was useful early on because it was educational for us to tune our teams. But we ended up doing away with it. But I agree with the architectural and engineering practice oversight, but you also have the business oversight, right? That you actually have business priorities, you're sifting those at the higher level. The management teams, executive teams need to be as agile as the product delivery teams are, and are coordinated so that the product delivery teams can align with the business goals and adding value on a continuous basis.
Could you guys elaborate on Scrum ban a little bit? With Scrum, the thing at least we are experiencing is people get hung up over the iteration boundaries. And with Kanban, I don't know much about it, but I'm uncomfortable with the idea of not having a time box. So any thoughts on?
That is Scrum ban. Basically, you have
Right.
a clock, which is not allowed in Kanban, but is allowed in Scrum, and you put them together. Scrum ban basically is Kanban with a clock. Although we can have an expert view.
So for us, Scrumban is your practices of continuous delivery are irrespective of when you're going to be delivering to the field, right? You're continuing with a cadence of constantly working through features and finishing them, so they're deliverable. However, you have an iteration that you're delivering to the field. You've got other things that you're aligning within the business for release cycles, and whatever's ready to align with that release cycle, you release it. And that's how we operate with Scrumban.
All right, guys, thank you very much. Thanks to our panelists, Dave Thomas, Randall Ward, Jean Michel, Dave Jellison, and Jürgen Spangel. Thanks, guys.